All right, let's bring in the panel now. Rachel Bade, CNN political analyst and congressional reporter for Politico. Tom Willis, Green Beret Distinguished Honor Graduate and Republican Senate candidate from West Virginia. And A. Scott Bolden, chair of the National Bar Association PAC and former chairman of the Washington, D.C. Democratic Party. Welcome, everyone. And let me start with you, Tom. Do you believe, former U.S. Army Special Forces, that there should be this style of ban on transgender men and women serving in the military?
Well, I think, Victor, the first priority for the military is to fight and win our nation's wars. So that's where we start. And when we come into the military, we go through in processing through what's called a MEPS station. They give you a very rigorous medical examination, and if you have any sort of medical issue that might affect your ability to serve and defend our nation, then you're disqualified. It sounds like the president has identified this as a potential hindrance to serving in a role to defend our nation, a hindrance to a deployability. And I think he has that prerogative as the commander-in-chief.
That was part of the justification that we heard from the Secretary of Defense. What do you think?
As somebody from a former military man, have you ever seen a detriment in any way to a transgender serving?
I've never served with a transgender troop in the U.S. Special Forces, so I don't have a personal experience with it. So again, I would defer to the prerogative of the president to make the decision as commander-in-chief.
Scott?
They certainly have to. The White House certainly has to link it to a health and safety issue. Remember, we got a federal court decision that has struck down this ban and said that it's discriminatory in nature. Look for there to be follow-up decisions, because what the state has to do is have a compelling state interest, narrowly tailor it to serve that interest. Here, they're linking it to health and safety. And so it's going to be challenged because the Supreme Court says, or the federal court says, unless you can show there's some risk there, then you can't discriminate against these group of fighters. And by the way, there's a history already of transgendered individuals serving in the military. Look at what their performance has been. And have there been any risk in regard to the safety of this country or the military? I think not.
Thousands serving now.
Let's look at something that President Trump tweeted as candidate back in June of 2016. He said, "Thank you to the LGBT community. I will fight for you while Hillary brings in more people that will threaten your freedoms and beliefs." Rachel, going back to that mindset, looking at today's, how did we get from there to here? Where do we go?
Well, the president sees this as him following through on a campaign promise. And, you know, my first reaction when I saw this last night was that President Trump finally got to Defense Secretary Mattis on this issue. Back when he first tweeted about this, that he was going to ban transgender troops, but last July, they actually had to scale this back in the Defense Department because Mattis was very upset that the president did this without telling the Defense Department or the defense community. He didn't tell Congress about this. And so they ended up staying it for a while, saying, we're going to research this, and then we'll come back at this at a later point. It's interesting to see that Mattis, it appears, has been able to get rid of a blanket ban and add some exceptions in here. For instance, they talk about select cases and only in substantial medical treatment costs. They also talk about people who have been stable for 36 months in their biological sex being able to serve, and those who were serving under the Obama administration being allowed to stay. So it does appear that Mattis, who clearly was uncomfortable with this to begin with, was able to make some exceptions that he can potentially use to protect these 4,000 to 15,000 transgender troops that are currently serving.
And the expectation is this will be in litigation.
What is stable, though? I mean, it connotes somehow that transgendered people are unstable. Do we want anybody that's unstable in the military? Do we? I don't think that's a standard that most of us can meet, but it's so offensive and discriminatory. You're going to see that language in all the federal court cases that are coming, that somehow that it suggests that transgendered people are unstable. It's just not true. They're born that way. They don't choose to be that way.
Reckless and unconstitutional, Tom, are how an attorney for the ACLU refers to this new policy.
So when you're talking about national defense, national security comes first, right? It trumps everything, because without national security, we don't have any other rights. It's constitutional. So, again, I think you need to focus on deployability. If a person can't deploy because they need some sort of medical procedure, if they can deploy only with a constant administration of some sort of medication, in my mind, that makes them non-deployable. We've become very spoiled as a nation, having nice FOBs, nice military bases where we have doctors and medical facilities. That may not always be the case when we're talking about national security. And if you have someone that can't deploy without a regular administration of medical attention or prescription medicine. In my opinion, that disqualifies them from service. We go through dental, medical exams, everything before we deploy, and I think it's important to consider that.
It's interesting, they're not always talking about national security here. I know when lawmakers on Capitol Hill, Republicans in particular who support this ban, talk about this issue, they view it as a taxpayer issue. They talk about significant costs to the military for sex change operations and gender therapies, et cetera. But there has been studies that show that this actually hasn't been a significant cost. So, it definitely plays well with the base, but I think this is going to end up in the courts. A lot of people think this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court at some point, and then the courts will just have to decide.
Yeah, and you'll see them compare the medical information to what if I've got diabetes, or what if I'm on antidepressants? Does that make me deplorable or unsafe? I think not, as long as I'm taking my medication.
We will certainly continue this conversation throughout the morning. Tom, Scott, Rachel, thank you all.